sister, the golden child, called me a loser, manipulated my parents, and then they decided to rewrite the will. And I'm a 22-year-old guy, and I've just graduated from college. My life might seem pretty good on the outside, but I've been dealing with some heavy stuff for as long as I can remember. I guess it all started when I was a kid, and I haven't been able to shake it since. Growing up, you'd think being part of a wealthy family would be a blessing, right? Well, let me tell you, it was more like a curse. I'm not saying we were mega rich or anything, but we had more money than most people around us. My dad was a big shot in the finance world, and my mom was a successful lawyer. We lived in a huge house, went on fancy vacations, and never had to worry about money. But honestly, I would have traded it all for a normal life. My parents sent me to this elite private school when I was just 7 years old. I remember my first day like it was yesterday. I was excited, nervous, all the usual stuff a kid feels when they're starting something new. But I quickly realized that I didn't fit in with the other kids. I thought maybe I would, since we all came from similar backgrounds, but I was wrong. Most of the kids there were already part of tight-knit cliques. Their parents were friends, they hung out at the same country clubs, and they had inside jokes that I didn't understand. At first, I tried to be friendly and join in, but they shut me out almost immediately. I overheard one of the boys, Tyler, saying that I was too new money to hang out with them. I didn't even know what that meant at the time, but I knew it wasn't good. The kids at that school were brutal. They'd pick on me for the dumbest things, like the brand of my backpack, the way I spoke, or the fact that I wasn't as into sports as they were. Tyler, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in making my life miserable. He was the ringleader of the group, always coming up with new ways to embarrass me in front of everyone. I remember this one time during recess when Tyler and his cronies cornered me by the playground. They started teasing me about my clothes, saying that my mom probably bought them on sale at some cheap department store. Then Tyler pushed me, and I fell backward into the dirt. The other kids just laughed, and I wanted to disappear. I couldn't understand why they hated me so much. I mean, we were all just kids. What had I done to deserve this? Things got worse after my sister, Emily, was born. I was 7 at the time, and I was so excited to be a big brother. I thought I'd finally have someone to share my life with, someone who would love me unconditionally. And for a little while, things were good. But then it became clear that Emily was what people like to call a golden child. My parents adored her from the moment she was born. She was this perfect, angelic little girl who could do no wrong. Don't get me wrong, I love Emily, and I always have. But it was hard not to feel resentful when all the attention shifted to her. My parents were always busy with work, but they somehow found time to dote on Emily. They'd spend hours playing with her, taking her to dance lessons, and showering her with gifts. Meanwhile, I felt like I was fading into the background. My dad, who used to take me to the park and throw a football around with me, suddenly didn't have the time. My mom, who would help me with my homework and read to me at night, was always too tired after dealing with Emily. At school, things didn't get any better. Tyler and his friends found out about Emily and started calling me the forgotten son. They'd taunt me by saying things like, "Guess your parents realized they messed up with you and decided to try again, huh?" It was like they knew exactly how to get under my skin. I'd come home from school, bruised and beaten down, but I couldn't bring myself to tell my parents. They were too wrapped up in Emily's world, and I didn't want to add to their stress. So, I kept it all inside, trying to pretend that everything was fine. Around the time I turned 9, something changed. I made a friend. His name was Max, and he was new to the school, just like I had been a couple of years earlier. Max was different from the other kids. He didn't care about money or status. He just wanted someone to hang out with. We bonded over our shared love of video games and comic books. For the first time, I had someone who actually liked me for who I was, not what my family's bank account looked like. Max and I became inseparable. We'd spend every recess together, hiding out in the corner of the schoolyard where the bullies couldn't find us. After school, we'd go to each other's houses and play video games for hours. Max was the first person I ever confided in about how lonely I felt. He told me he understood. His parents were divorced, and his dad had basically abandoned him. We were two kids who felt like the world had forgotten about us, and we found comfort in each other's company. As we got older, Max and I started talking about our futures. We both hated the idea of working boring office jobs like our parents, but we didn't know what else we could do. Then, one day, Max mentioned something that changed everything: investing. His uncle was some big-time investor, and he'd told Max that the real way to make money wasn't by working for it, but by making your money work for you. The idea fascinated both of us. We started reading everything we could about investments, stocks, and financial markets. We didn't really understand most of it at first, but we were determined to learn. By the time we were in high school, we were obsessed. We'd spend our free periods in the library, poring over finance books and talking about which stocks we'd invest in if we had the money. While the other kids were planning their weekends, we were daydreaming about how we'd turn our small savings into a fortune. It was nerdy as hell, but we didn't care. It felt like we'd finally found something we were good at, something that could give us the future we wanted. Max and I applied to the same university, determined to study finance and investment together. Our parents were thrilled, especially mine, who saw it as a chance for me to follow in my dad's footsteps. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something that made them proud. But there was still this lingering resentment inside me, this feeling that no matter what I did, I'd never be as important as Emily. University life was a mixed bag. On one hand, Max and I thrived academically. We were like sponges, soaking up everything we could about the world of finance. We joined the investment club, participated in stock trading competitions, and even started a small online business together to test out some of the strategies we'd been learning. It was exciting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. But there were also dark moments. Max and I were still pretty socially awkward, and we struggled to fit in with the other students. Most of them came from similar backgrounds to ours, but they seemed so much more comfortable in their own skin. They'd throw huge parties, go on exotic trips, and always seemed to have a million friends around them. Max and I tried to join in, but we always felt like outsiders. It was like we were still those same kids from the schoolyard, hiding from the bullies. Things took a strange turn in our second year. Max started dating a girl named Lily, who was also in our finance program. She was smart, driven, and beautiful. Basically everything Max could have wanted. At first, I was happy for him. He deserved someone who made him feel special. But as their relationship got more serious, I started to feel a weird sense of jealousy. It wasn't that I had feelings for Lily or anything like that. I just didn't like the way she was changing Max. Max began spending less time with me and more time with Lily. He'd skip our study sessions to go on dates, and he even started talking about dropping out of the investment club because it was too nerdy. It was like he was trying to reinvent himself to fit into Lily's world, and I hated it. I tried to talk to him about it, but he brushed me off, saying I was overreacting. One night, things came to a head. Max and Lily invited me to a party at her friend's apartment. I didn't really want to go, but Max insisted, saying it would be fun. The party was packed with people I didn't know, and I felt out of place from the moment I walked in. Max and Lily were off in their own little world, and I ended up sitting on the couch by myself, nursing a beer and trying not to look like a total loser. After a while, I decided to leave. I didn't even bother saying goodbye to Max. I just slipped out the door and started walking back to my dorm. But as I was leaving the building, I heard someone calling my name. I turned around and saw Max running after me, looking pissed off. He asked me why I'd left without saying anything, and I told him the truth. I felt like a third wheel, and I didn't belong there. Max snapped at me, accusing me of being jealous of his relationship with Lily. I denied it, but he wouldn't let it go. We ended up having a huge argument right there on the street, with Max yelling at me about how I was holding him back and how he wanted more out of life than just sitting around talking about stocks all day. It was like a punch to the gut. I'd never seen Max so angry before, and it hurt to hear him say those things. I tried to defend myself, but he just kept going, saying that maybe we weren't meant to be friends forever, and that people change. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, feeling like my whole world was crumbling. Max stormed off, and I walked back to my dorm alone, feeling numb. I couldn't believe that our friendship, something that had been the one constant in my life, was falling apart. I wanted to text him, to apologize or something, but I didn't know what to say. So I just went to bed, hoping that maybe things would be better in the morning. But they weren't. Max started avoiding me after that night. He stopped sitting with me in class, and he dropped out of the investment club without even telling me. It was like I'd been erased from his life. I tried to reach out to him a few times, but he always had some excuse for why he couldn't talk. Eventually, I just gave up. That was one of the darkest periods of my life. I felt completely alone. My best friend, the one person who'd always been there for me, was gone. I threw myself into my studies, trying to distract myself from the pain. I started working out more, going to the gym every day to blow off steam. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Max and Lily had broken up. Apparently, it hadn't been as perfect as it seemed. Part of me wanted to reach out to Max to see if we could patch things up, but I was too hurt. I figured if he wanted to talk, he'd come to me, but he never did. I finished my degree and graduated with honors, but it didn't feel like much of an accomplishment. My parents were proud, of course, especially since I'd followed in my dad's footsteps, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from it all. So, I decided to take a gap year before starting my career. I needed time to figure out who I was and what I wanted out of life. That brings me to now. I'm 22, living in a small apartment in the city, and trying to make sense of everything. I've been working part-time at a startup while I figure out my next move. I still think about Max a lot. I wonder if he's okay, if he's happy. Part of me wants to reach out to him, but another part of me is scared that he won't want to hear from me. And then there's Emily. She's 15 now, and she's still the golden child. My parents are as obsessed with her as ever, and it's like I'm just a footnote in their lives. I haven't told them about what happened with Max, or how lost I feel. They wouldn't understand. They're too wrapped up in their perfect little world with Emily. After I graduated from university, I found myself in this strange limbo. I had my degree in finance and investment, a solid GPA, and all the credentials that should have made me a hot commodity in the job market. But the truth was, I felt completely unmotivated. I didn't know if I wanted to dive headfirst into the finance world, or if I even belonged there. The problem was, I didn't have much of a choice. My parents, particularly my dad, had always envisioned a specific path for me. From the moment I declared my major, it was like my future was set in stone. My dad would drop hints about how I could join him at the firm where he worked, a top-tier investment bank in the city. He'd go on about the prestige, the salary, and the network I'd build by working there. To him, it was the natural next step in my life. To me, it felt like a trap. Don't get me wrong, I respect my dad a lot. He's worked hard his whole life, climbing the ranks to get where he is. But his life isn't mine. The idea of following in his footsteps, spending the next 40 years in some sterile office, dealing with high-stress clients and playing the corporate game, made me feel sick to my stomach. I just didn't have the heart to tell him that. Instead, I played along. After graduation, I went through the motions, sending out resumes, attending interviews, and networking with people my dad introduced me to. All the while, I felt this gnawing sense of dread, like I was marching toward a future I didn't want but couldn't escape. It wasn't just my dad who had expectations. My mom, too, had her own ideas about what my life should look like. She didn't care as much about the career specifics, but she had this vision of me settling down with a nice girl, getting married, and giving her grandchildren. Every time we talked, she'd drop little hints, asking if I'd met anyone, or mentioning how I was getting to the age where I should start thinking about my future family. It was suffocating. And then there was Emily. My parents had always been fixated on her, but as she got older, their obsession reached new heights. Emily was everything they wanted me to be: charming, successful, and perfectly fitting into the mold they created for her. She was excelling in school, already being scouted by Ivy League universities, and she had a social life that my parents couldn't stop bragging about. To them, Emily was the golden child, and I was, well, just the other kid. The pressure from my parents was relentless. Every time I visited home, it was the same conversation. My dad would grill me about my job search, reminding me of the opportunities I was letting slip by. My mom would ask if I was seeing anyone, then subtly suggest I attend some social event where I might meet the right kind of people. And Emily, well, she didn't say much, but the way she'd smirk when our parents praised her accomplishments said it all. I was the family's underachiever, and everyone knew it. Eventually, I caved. I accepted a job offer from the same firm where my dad worked, though I made sure to join a different department to avoid being under his direct supervision. The position was in investment analysis, predictably boring, but it paid well, and it kept my parents off my back. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't so bad, that I could learn to enjoy the work. But deep down, I knew I was just going through the motions. The firm was exactly what I'd expected: corporate, cutthroat, and soul-crushing. My coworkers were all carbon copies of each other, driven, ambitious, and completely absorbed in the world of finance. They lived and breathed numbers, constantly comparing salaries, promotions, and bonuses. It was like being back in school with Tyler and his cronies, only now they wore expensive suits and drank overpriced coffee. I struggled to fit in. I'd spend my days staring at spreadsheets, pretending to be interested in market trends and economic forecasts, but my mind was always somewhere else. I'd watch my coworkers with a mix of envy and disdain. They seemed to thrive in this environment, while I felt like an imposter, waiting to be exposed. One day, about 6 months into the job, I had a particularly rough day. My boss, a guy named Eric, had been on my case all morning about some report I'd filed late. He was one of those guys who never missed an opportunity to remind you of your mistakes, and he loved to play power games. After his third passive-aggressive comment, I couldn't take it anymore. I left the office during lunch and never went back. I didn't quit right away, though. Instead, I just disappeared. I turned off my phone, locked myself in my apartment, and spent the next few days avoiding reality. I knew it was irresponsible, that I was probably ruining any chance of making it in this career, but I didn't care. I was done pretending to be something I wasn't. After a week of radio silence, I finally mustered the courage to tell my parents what had happened. My dad was furious, as expected. He couldn't believe I'd thrown away such a promising career. He accused me of being lazy, of not appreciating the opportunities I'd been given. My mom was less harsh, but I could tell she was disappointed. She kept asking if there was something wrong, if I was depressed, if I needed therapy. It was like they couldn't fathom that maybe I just didn't want the life they'd mapped out for me. But the worst part was Emily. She didn't say much during our family meeting, just sat there with that same smirk she'd had since we were kids. When our parents finally left the room, she turned to me and said, "You really screwed up this time, huh?" There was no malice in her voice, just a cold indifference that stung more than any insult could have. With no job, no direction, and no support from my family, I fell into a deep funk. I spent weeks holed up in my apartment, barely eating or sleeping. I ignored calls from my friends, who I knew would ask questions I didn't have answers to. Max, of course, was still out of my life, so I didn't have anyone to lean on. One night, after yet another argument with my dad, I decided I needed to get away. I packed a bag and drove to the coast, where I rented a small cabin for a month. It was isolated, quiet, and exactly what I needed. I spent my days walking along the beach, thinking about my life and how it had gone so off track. I realized that I'd spent so long trying to meet everyone else's expectations that I had no idea what I actually wanted. During my time at the cabin, I met someone. Her name was Sarah. She was a local artist, living in a small house near the beach. We bumped into each other at a coffee shop one morning, and something about her drew me in. She had this calm, unpretentious vibe that was the complete opposite of everything I'd known in the city. We started talking, and before I knew it, we were spending every day together. Sarah was unlike anyone I'd ever met. She didn't care about money or status. She cared about living a simple, fulfilling life. She spent her days painting, walking her dog, and enjoying the beauty of nature. It was a life I'd never imagined for myself, but it fascinated me. Being around her made me feel at peace in a way I hadn't felt in years. As we got to know each other, I opened up to Sarah about everything. My family, my failed career, the pressure I felt to be someone I wasn't. She listened without judgment, offering support and perspective that I desperately needed. She made me realize that it was okay to not have all the answers, that life didn't have to follow a set path. Our relationship grew quickly, and I found myself falling for her. But there was a problem. My time at the cabin was running out, and I had to figure out what to do next. Sarah asked me to stay, to build a life with her on the coast. Part of me wanted to, But I knew it wasn't that simple. I still had unresolved issues with my family, and I couldn't just run away from them forever. So, I returned to the city, but not without a plan. I told my parents that I wasn't going back to the firm, that I needed to figure out my own path. My dad was livid, as expected. He told me I was making a huge mistake, that I was wasting my potential. My mom cried, asking why I was throwing everything away. Even Emily, who usually didn't show much emotion, seemed shocked. But this time, I didn't back down. I told them I was going to take some time to figure out what I really wanted. I'd saved up enough money from my job to support myself for a while, and I was determined to make the most of it. My dad scoffed, saying that I'd come crawling back once I realized how hard the real world was. My mom tried to be supportive, but I could tell she didn't understand. Emily, well, she just walked away without saying a word. I moved back to the coast and rented a small apartment near Sarah's place. We started building a life together, slowly and deliberately. I picked up odd jobs here and there to pay the bills, things like bartending, dog walking, and even working at a local surf shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it gave me time to think. Living by the coast with Sarah was like a dream. We spent our days exploring the beach, hiking in the nearby forests, and working on our respective passions. Her painting, and me, well, I wasn't sure yet. I knew I didn't want to go back to finance, but I didn't know what else I could do. The thought of starting over was daunting, but with Sarah by my side, it didn't feel as scary. But, of course, life isn't a fairy tale. About 6 months into our new life together, things took a turn. Sarah was diagnosed with a serious illness, something that came out of nowhere and shook us both to the core. It was a rare autoimmune disorder that required expensive treatments and constant medical attention. Suddenly, our simple, peaceful life was thrown into chaos. I was determined to be there for Sarah, to support her through everything. But as the medical bills started piling up, I realized that my odd jobs weren't going to cut it. I needed to find a way to make more money, and fast. I tried going back to the city to pick up some consulting work, but it was like stepping into a nightmare. The stress, the pressure, the constant demands, I couldn't do it. I'd left that world behind for a reason, and now I was faced with the harsh reality that I couldn't escape it entirely. To make matters worse, my parents found out about Sarah's illness. My mom was concerned, of course, but my dad saw it as an opportunity to push me back into the corporate world. He offered to help with the medical bills, but only if I returned to the firm. He even went so far as to set up a meeting with his boss, hoping to lure me back with the promise of a promotion and a hefty salary increase. I was furious. It felt like my dad was trying to exploit Sarah's illness to get what he wanted. I told him I wasn't interested, that I'd figure out a way to support Sarah on my own. He called me foolish, saying I was letting pride get in the way of doing what was best for her. My mom begged me to reconsider, reminding me that Sarah's health was at stake. Even Emily weighed in, saying that I was being selfish and irresponsible. I was torn. I loved Sarah, and I wanted to do whatever it took to help her. But going back to the firm felt like selling my soul. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place, with no easy way out. In the end, I decided to compromise. I took on some freelance work in finance, not with my dad's firm, but with smaller clients who needed investment advice. It wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills and kept me from completely sacrificing my principles. As Sarah's treatment continued, our relationship was tested in ways I never imagined. The stress of her illness, combined with my struggle to balance work and our life together, put a strain on us. There were days when I felt like I was drowning, like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. I loved Sarah with all my heart, but there were moments when I wondered if I was strong enough to handle everything. During one of her hospital stays, I ran into Max. It was a random encounter. I was sitting in the waiting room, exhausted and stressed, when I saw him walk by. At first, I wasn't sure it was him. He looked different, older, more worn out, like life had taken its toll on him. But when our eyes met, I knew it was Max. He came over, and we exchanged awkward hellos. It had been years since we'd last spoken, and the silence between us was heavy. Max asked what I was doing there, and I told him about Sarah. He listened quietly, nodding, and then told me he was there for his mom. She was battling cancer, and things didn't look good. We sat in that waiting room for hours, catching up on everything that had happened since our falling out. It was strange, but in that sterile hospital, with both of us facing life's harsh realities, it felt like the distance between us melted away. Max told me about his life after we drifted apart. He'd struggled too, bouncing between jobs and trying to find his place in the world. After his breakup with Lily, he'd spiraled for a while, losing himself in alcohol and bad decisions. But eventually, he'd pulled himself together and found work in a small investment firm, doing the kind of work we used to dream about. He admitted that he wasn't happy, but he was making do. Our conversation was bittersweet. It was nice to reconnect, but it also made me realize how much we'd both lost over the years. We weren't the same kids who used to talk about changing the world. Life had beaten us down, and now we were just trying to survive. After that encounter, Max and I stayed in touch. We weren't as close as we once were, but it felt good to have a friend again, someone who understood what I was going through. We'd grab coffee every now and then, talking about work, life, and everything in between. It was like we were rebuilding something that had been broken for too long. But as Sarah's condition worsened, I found myself pulling away from everyone, including Max. I was consumed by fear and anxiety, terrified of losing the one person who'd brought light back into my life. I started working more, taking on every freelance job I could find to cover the mounting medical expenses. It was a vicious cycle, working to pay the bills, but losing time with Sarah in the process. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I came home to find Sarah waiting for me. She looked pale, weak, and I could see the pain in her eyes. She told me that she couldn't keep doing this, that she didn't want me to sacrifice everything for her. She said she loved me, but she didn't want to be the reason I gave up on my own happiness. I didn't know what to say. I tried to reassure her, to tell her that she was my happiness, but she just shook her head. She asked me to promise that if things got worse, I wouldn't let her suffering drag me down with her. She wanted me to live my life, to find joy again, even if it meant letting go. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever had. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I could handle it, that I wouldn't let her go no matter what. But deep down, I knew she was right. I'd lost sight of myself in my desperation to save her, and it was tearing us both apart. So, I made the promise, even though it broke my heart. I promised that if the time came, I'd let her go, and I'd find a way to keep living. It was the least I could do for the woman who'd given me so much. Sarah passed away a few months later. It was peaceful, in the middle of the night, with me holding her hand. I've never felt a pain so deep, a loss so profound. After she was gone, I went through the motions, planning the funeral, dealing with the estate, and trying to make sense of a world without her. The weeks that followed were a blur. I didn't know who I was without Sarah, without the life we'd built together. I felt like I was drifting, untethered and lost. My parents tried to help, but their version of support was pushing me to move on, to get back to work, to make something of myself. They couldn't understand that I needed time to grieve, to heal. Even Max struggled to know what to say. He was there for me, but I could tell he didn't know how to handle my grief. We'd sit in silence more often than not, both of us feeling the weight of everything we'd lost. Eventually, I decided to leave the coast. There were too many memories there, too many reminders of Sarah. I packed up my things and moved to a small town up north, where nobody knew me, where I could start over. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to escape. I've been here for a few months now, trying to figure out what comes next. I'm still working freelance, but it's more out of necessity than passion. I'm trying to find meaning again, to rebuild my life piece by piece. It's not easy, but I'm taking it one day at a time. I still think about Sarah every day. I miss her more than I can put into words, but I'm trying to honor the promise I made to her, to live my life, to find joy again, even if it takes time. After I moved to that small town up north, life slowly started to get better. It wasn't easy, but I was learning to live again after everything that had happened. I kept to myself mostly, focusing on my freelance work and trying to figure out what the hell I wanted from life. The town was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what I needed after the chaos I'd left behind. But, of course, peace never lasts, especially when you have a family like mine. It started with a phone call from my mom. She sounded unusually stressed, which immediately put me on edge. We hadn't been particularly close since I left for the coast, and our conversations were usually brief and superficial. This time, though, she was almost frantic. She wanted me to come home for a family meeting. I knew better than to ignore something like that, so I agreed, even though I had a bad feeling about it. When I arrived at my parents' house, the tension in the air was palpable. My dad was sitting in his usual chair, staring at the floor, while my mom hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Emily was there too, of course, perched on the edge of the couch with that same smirk I'd grown to despise. It didn't take long for me to realize that whatever this meeting was about, it wasn't going to be good. My dad started off by saying that they'd made some important decisions regarding the family's future. He spoke in that stern, authoritative tone he always used when he was delivering bad news, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Then, without any preamble, he told me that he and my mom had decided to rewrite their wills, leaving everything to Emily. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. My parents had always been distant, always more focused on Emily, but this was a betrayal on a whole new level. They weren't just favoring her anymore. They were cutting me out of their lives entirely. Before I could say anything, Emily jumped in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She started going on about how she'd convinced them it was the right thing to do, that I was struggling, and it wasn't fair to burden me with responsibilities I clearly couldn't handle. She said that she was in a better position to manage the family's assets, and that it was for my own good. The smugness in her voice made me want to scream. My mom chimed in, trying to justify their decision. She said that they weren't doing this to hurt me, but because they were worried about me. She mentioned how I'd isolated myself, how I'd abandoned my career and my family. My dad nodded along, adding that Emily had proven herself to be the more responsible and stable one, and that this was what was best for everyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were acting like I was some kind of lost cause, someone who couldn't be trusted to take care of themselves, let alone anything else. It was like they'd written me off completely, and Emily was just sitting there, basking in the glow of their praise. When I finally found my voice, I asked them how they could do this to me. I told them that I'd been doing everything I could to build a life for myself, that I'd faced challenges they couldn't even begin to understand. But my words fell on deaf ears. My dad dismissed my concerns, saying that I'd made poor choices, and that they were simply protecting the family's interests. Emily, ever the manipulator, turned the conversation back on me. She started listing off every mistake I'd ever made, twisting them into proof that I was a failure. She brought up my decision to leave the firm, saying it was reckless and irresponsible. She mentioned Sarah, implying that my relationship with her was another example of my inability to make good decisions. It was like she was trying to rewrite my entire life, turning everything I'd done into evidence of my incompetence. My mom, who'd always been more gentle, wasn't much better. She tried to soften the blow by saying that they'd always loved me, but that this was the best decision for the family. She said she hoped I'd understand, that I'd find a way to move forward with my life. But all I could hear was that I didn't matter to them anymore, that I'd been replaced by the golden child. I knew there was no point in arguing. My parents had made up their minds, and Emily had them wrapped around her finger. I could see it in their eyes. They truly believed that she was the only one who could carry on the family legacy. I left the house that day feeling completely defeated, like everything I'd ever done had been for nothing. Over the next few weeks, I tried to come to terms with what had happened. I kept my distance from my family, avoiding their calls and ignoring their messages. Emily, of course, didn't leave me alone. She sent me patronizing texts, reminding me that this was for the best, that I needed to accept it and move on. It was like she was enjoying every second of my misery. But something inside me snapped. I realized that I couldn't keep living my life in the shadow of my family's expectations. I was done trying to prove myself to people who would never see me for who I really was. So, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to leave the country. I'd always been fascinated by the idea of living somewhere remote, away from the pressures and demands of the life I'd been born into. I started looking into places where I could start fresh, where I could build a life on my own terms. That's when I stumbled upon an opportunity in Canada, a job as a forester in a small town nestled in the mountains. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of: solitude, nature, and a chance to disconnect from everything that had been weighing me down. I didn't tell my family about my plans. I didn't see the point. They'd made it clear where I stood in their lives, and I wasn't interested in their opinions anymore. I packed up my things, sold what I didn't need, and booked a one-way ticket to Canada. The town I moved to was small, with a population of just a few hundred people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved at a slower pace. My job as a forester was simple: maintain the trails, monitor the wildlife, and make sure the forest stayed healthy. It was hard work, physically demanding, but it was exactly what I needed. There was something incredibly freeing about being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. In my new life, I made a few friends, people who didn't care about my past or where I came from. There was Jack, an older guy who'd been working as a forester for decades. He took me under his wing, teaching me everything I needed to know about the job and the area. He was a quiet man, but wise in a way that only comes from a life lived close to nature. There was also Laura, the owner of the local general store. She was tough and no-nonsense, but with a heart of gold. We'd chat whenever I came into town for supplies, and she'd always have a cup of coffee waiting for me. But perhaps the most unexpected connection I made was with a woman named Rachel. She was a teacher in the town's small school, and we met one day when I was out on the trails. She'd gotten lost while on a hike, and I found her just as the sun was starting to set. I helped her find her way back, and we ended up talking for hours. Rachel was smart, kind, and had a sense of humor that immediately put me at ease. We started spending more time together, and before I knew it, we were in a relationship. Rachel was different from anyone I'd ever dated before. She understood my need for solitude, my desire to live a simple life. She never tried to change me or push me in a direction I didn't want to go. Being with her felt easy, natural, like I could finally be myself without any pretense. We didn't talk much about my past, but she knew enough to understand why I'd left it all behind. And she respected that, which meant more to me than I could ever express. Life in Canada was everything I'd hoped it would be. I felt like I'd finally found my place in the world, far away from the chaos of my family and the expectations that had haunted me for so long. But just when I thought I'd escaped it all, the past came crashing back in. It started with a letter. I received it at the forester station one morning, and my heart sank when I saw the familiar handwriting. It was from Emily. I debated throwing it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a long, rambling letter where she detailed how well things were going back home. She talked about how she was thriving in her new role, managing the family's assets and making smart investments that my dad praised constantly. It was clear that she was rubbing it in my face, gloating about how she'd taken over the life I was supposed to have. But there was more. Emily mentioned that my dad's health was deteriorating. He'd had a minor heart attack a few months back, something they kept from me because they didn't want to worry me. She hinted that my dad had been asking about me, wondering where I was and what I was doing. She even suggested that I should come home to make amends before it was too late. The letter sent me into a tailspin. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep living my life without looking back. But another part of me felt guilty. Despite everything, despite how they treated me, they were still my family. And if my dad was really sick, could I live with myself if I didn't at least see him one last time? I agonized over the decision for days. I talked to Jack about it, and he gave me some sage advice. You've got to do what's right for you, not for them. Don't let guilt drive you back to a place that almost broke you. Rachel was supportive too, but she didn't push me one way or the other. She knew this was something I had to figure out on my own. In the end, I decided to go back. I booked a flight and prepared myself for what I knew would be an emotional and difficult visit. But when I arrived at my parents' house, nothing could have prepared me for what I found. My dad was a shadow of the man I'd known. He'd lost weight, his face was gaunt, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that I'd never seen before. My mom was by his side, as always, but she looked older, worn out by the stress of caring for him. And then there was Emily, still as poised and perfect as ever, but with a coldness in her demeanor that chilled me to the bone. The visit was a disaster from the start. My dad barely acknowledged me, His attention focused entirely on Emily and the important business matters they discussed. My mom tried to be warm, but it was clear she was uncomfortable with my presence. Emily, of course, was the worst. She kept making snide comments, reminding me of how I'd abandoned the family, how I'd let them down. She acted like she was the savior of the family, the one who'd stepped up when I couldn't. I tried to talk to my dad, to have a real conversation with him, but it was impossible. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in his own world to see me as anything other than a disappointment. The only time he really looked at me was when he told me that he was glad he'd rewritten the will, that he was confident Emily would take care of everything after he was gone. It was like a final, crushing blow, one that left me reeling. After a few days, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags and left without saying goodbye. I realized that I didn't need their validation, their approval, or their money. I'd spent too much of my life trying to be someone I wasn't, trying to meet their impossible expectations. It was time to let go, once and for all. When I returned to Canada, I felt a strange sense of relief. The visit had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It helped me finally close the door on that chapter of my life. I knew that I couldn't change my family, and I couldn't change the way they saw me. But I could change the way I lived my life, and that's exactly what I planned to do. I threw myself back into my work as a forester, finding solace in the simplicity of my new life. Rachel and I grew closer, and I started to think about the future in a way I never had before. Maybe I didn't need a big career, a fancy title, or a mountain of money to be happy. Maybe all I needed was a quiet life, surrounded by the people and the things I loved. A few months after I returned, I got a call from my mom. My dad had passed away. The news hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't go back for the funeral. I couldn't. I knew that it would only reopen wounds that were still healing. Instead, I sent my condolences and made a donation to a charity in his name. It was my way of saying goodbye, of letting go of the pain and the resentment. Emily tried to reach out a few times after that, but I didn't respond. I didn't need her in my life, and I didn't want to be dragged back into the toxic dynamics of our family. I had a new life now, one that I was building on my own terms, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. So, here I am, Reddit. I've found peace in the mountains of Canada, working as a forester and living a simple, fulfilling life. I've learned that happiness isn't about money, status, or meeting other people's expectations. It's about finding what truly makes you happy and holding on to it with everything you've got. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it. I've let go of the past, of the hurt and the anger, and I'm ready to embrace whatever comes next. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. Your support and advice have meant more to me than I can say. I'm signing off now, ready to live the life I've always wanted. Let us know what you liked in the comments. Take care, everyone.